Come on, Acty. I don't have all day. If you want to come with me, you need to hurry up. My mother moved faster than you.
No, she didn't.
What? You make 10 jerks feel like 100. You half-witted, scruffy-looking...
Nerf herder?
We gotta get back to the past, to the 20th century. Digging through the bubble wrap into your memories. Back was the collector, he's protecting what we find. Relentless heavy metal guns keep us safe through time. RetroBlasting.
This is not a toy.
Just the corners of your mind. RetroBlasting. The stuff you love since you were 9. We're blasting into the past to see what thrills still last.
A while back, I received a surprise Star Wars donation from Plastic Galaxy in Oklahoma. The donation was so generous and overwhelming, I made a promise. If Rogue One is good, if I like Rogue One, I will review these toys. After 1985, for those of us that lived it, Star Wars went into hibernation. For a solid 6 years, there was very little to enjoy unless you were able to get your hands on the West End Games role-playing books. There were no new movies, and that meant no new toys. Period. And it sucked. But in 1991, Timothy Zahn released the first novel in the Thrawn trilogy of books, what my generation would adopt as our own episodes 7, 8, and 9. And with that, interest in Star Wars was rekindled, and not just survived, but thrived on this new expanded universe made up solely of books, comics, and a few PC games. In 1995, Kenner, now owned by Hasbro, relaunched the Star Wars action figure line to rabid demand. In the preceding decade, original Star Wars toys had risen in value. I was always hunting for them myself, and there was no eBay or even an internet to assist me. The appeal of Star Wars toys being easy to find in stores again was too great to ignore, and so we thought we'd hedge our bets by buying 2 of everything, so that we'd have a mint-on-card example when these new Star Wars toys inevitably skyrocketed in value. I even got a job at Toys R Us just so I could get the toys as they came out. But these new toys, marketed under the Power of the Force branding yet again, would become one of the key reasons why RetroBlasting is so staunchly devoted to vintage toys and largely ambivalent to modern toys. Now known as Power of the Force 2 by collectors, the figures were all jacked up on steroids, looking more like wrestlers than the actors in the films. I tried to collect them all, but it wasn't easy with demand being so high. Kenner even re-released the vintage vehicles with new deco and details, but didn't bother to ensure compatibility with the new figures, which were so beefy they often didn't fit in the vintage ships. By 1998, some of the figures were so difficult to find, I gave up for good. Occasionally, I'd grab something key, like Bespin Luke or the re-released A-Wing, since I never had that as a kid. But I largely stayed away until Episode 1 came out. And I went to the first Force Friday at Toys R Us and loaded up on toys for a film I hadn't seen yet, only to learn I'd just invested in action figures for a film I wouldn't like. I didn't make the same mistakes again. Aside from the random Bespin Luke figure, I didn't buy any more modern Star Wars toys. In 2005, I sold off 95% of all the modern toys I'd ever bought over that decade for pennies on the dollar and refocused solely on vintage. So here we are. I've seen Rogue One and I really enjoyed it. I'm a man of my word. So how about these Rogue One toys? Apparently, right around the time I bailed out of modern Star Wars, the figures started to get really posable. But then just a few years ago, Hasbro backed off that direction and returned to the more old-school Kenner style of straight arms, legs, and a turning head, what hardcore collectors refer to as 5 points of articulation or 5 POA. There's a contingent of modern collectors who are quick to denounce old-school 5 POA because they believe that posing is the be-all end-all. But the posability they're talking about is not the usable kind we remember from 80s G.I. Joes. Instead, it's a very gummy-jointed kind of design, where the figures can be contorted 100 ways, but the actual poses aren't all that usable. The results were figures that are more like puzzles than representations of human mobility. Collectors call these super articulated. Take Bespin Han Solo from a few years back. He's got knees that bend, and hips that hinge, and thighs that rotate, and ankles that pivot, but just try getting him in a basic seated position. You have to rotate the legs until his trouser stripes are completely out of alignment. Then try to bend the knees, hoping you don't break them. And the knees don't quite get to 90 degrees. Meanwhile, an old G.I. Joe just sits like a pro. Dude, how can you suck at sitting? What about that classic Han Solo shooting pose? No amount of knobby joints on this figure made that possible either. And few, if any, of the lightsaber-wielding characters gain much benefit from this articulation. The figures are capable of wielding the saber with both hands, but usually not very well. The 5 POA figure is also better at standing, too. The figures for Rogue One are constructed this way as well, and there's a nice synergy with the vintage Kenner figures, since this movie takes place right before the original Star Wars film. The figures are more detailed certainly than the ones we grew up with, but their posability is the same, and their general proportions are closer to the vintage line rather than the beefy He-Man sculpts from the 1990s. Which means the Rogue One action figures are pretty straightforward, and they include little features that we all wished our vintage Star Wars figures had had. Remember how we always wished those holsters molded to their legs would work, and we kinda pulled it off with Hoth Han Solo? Well, with the crew of Rogue One, those sidearms are neatly stowed. And similar to the Kenner line, you have a few figures that barely made it into the background that got representation. As a group, the Rogue One heroes are an interesting crew to look at, and the only stick wielder is Chirrut, which is nice. You've also got your pick of the enemy troops as well. Beyond Darth Vader and Krennic, you get Death Troopers, Scarif Shore Troopers, TIE pilots, ground crew, and if you have the AT-ACT, you get the driver. Hasbro's Rogue One also gives us the best basic Stormtrooper figure since the vintage line. There's no arguing how great this Stormtrooper looks, and he comes with a conversion kit that can turn him into a Sand Trooper if you feel compelled. If you actually want a dedicated Sand Trooper, you have to buy a 2-pack of figures, which is also the only way to get Baze Malbus. And this is where the frustrations begin. Baze is a main hero in the movie and should be available separately. But he's not. To get him, you pay double. But why pay double when you can pay 4 times the price for important characters from Rogue One? Saw Gerrera and his goon? They only come in a $40 4-pack from Hasbro that's so hard to find I eventually just had to resort to eBay to get it. And it's the only way to get the hover tank driver. But don't worry, there's no hover tank available for him to drive. Brilliant, Hasbro. You'll also notice that every basic figure costs $7.99. Yes, inflation is a real thing, but it seems Hasbro felt it necessary to pack every figure with a massive action backpack that shoots projectiles or threads a zip line. When we were kids, the characters and their movie-carried weapon were enough. Let's say the additional accessory allows Hasbro to add $2 more to the total cost. What if Hasbro dropped the dumb accessories and suddenly the figure was only $5.99? At that price, a parent might be willing to buy their kid 2 figures, or maybe 3. And at that moment, the child has a solid foothold in the line and will want to buy more characters to fill out the collection. That's how it worked for us in the 80s. I have to assume it might work that way for kids today. Overall, the new figures for Rogue One are nice representations of the movie characters, with good sculpts and variety. Yes, they're modern toys, but this is a new movie with new characters, and Hasbro is also making a significant number of variation figures, most notably with Jyn Erso. This isn't surprising given that last year Hasbro took a lot of heat for their Force Awakens line sorely lacking in Rey figures, and I guess they didn't want to make the same mistake with Jyn. We've got Jyn in a headscarf, Jyn in a hat and poncho, Jyn in Imperial disguise, and even Jyn with no headscarf and sandy boots. This version comes with the AT-ACT, which was a scene that was prominently in the trailer, but didn't actually make it into the real movie. In fact, both this Jyn and the R2 droid that come with the AT-ACT weren't in the final film. You'd think Hasbro would have used those 2 figure slots for characters that matter, like, I don't know, Casseon in Imperial disguise, or a rebel soldier would have been nice, or hell, Blue Leader. The funny part is this AT-ACT Jyn Erso isn't actually accurate to that deleted scene. The figure is wearing a jacket under her vest. This jacket isn't with her on Scarif at the end of the film, just the vest. But fear not, because Hasbro is still making those super articulated figures and selling them at Walmart. And among them is, yes, a Jyn Erso sans jacket, complete with a multi-part sniper rifle and her vest. If I had to pick a fail from all of this Erso-ness, it would have to be the one with the hat and goggles. She cannot move one arm thanks to the poncho and air bottle on her belt, and she doesn't stand all that well either. Casseon gets 2 basic figures, one with his coat and one with his jacket. He also has a super articulated version at Walmart, also in the jacket. You can effectively get Casseon in his jacket 3 ways, either with those bendy limbs from Walmart, or the old school style figure which is packed both in a Toys R Us exclusive 2-pack with a Stormtrooper and with the U-Wing fighter vehicle. Those latter 2 are the exact same figure. Again, another missed opportunity to give buyers a different character, like Blue Leader. But any toy company would be in a tough spot with Rogue One. Almost every figure is an effigy of death. Jyn dies, Cass dies, Baze dies, Bodhi dies, Chirrut dies, K2 dies, Krennic dies, Blue Leader dies. But even if Blue Leader had lived, it wouldn't make a difference because there'd be no X-Wing for him to fly. And this is where the Rogue One line really suffers from the modern Hasbro strategy. You have this line of decent-looking figures, but only 3 vehicles to choose from. All of them are undersized, overpriced, and right here in the studio.